United States Olympic Committee Endurance Training Think Tank, 2007, Part 2. As a reminder, this particular audio notes is a group of Olympic level coaches, moderators, and coaching managers discussing several topics dealing from periodization to recovery to tapering to politics with the national governing body, etc. So it's a little bit of a different format, much more of an informal lecture session. So I'll say that at the beginning of each one of these audio notes because it's much different than what you've heard of before. And typically I'll say the first name or the last name, and then I'll give you the information that they just said. Larson, in response to Dean's question about injuries and catering or catching African runners, suggests athletes must have enough talent first. Then it will take several years to catch Africans without getting hurt. After college, because the Africans' bodies are stronger from intense volume training and running without shoes. He suggests cross-training can be supplemented to make USA runners stronger, and this too takes time, so athletes slowly build strength without injuries. George, in response to Larson's question, idea about cross-training, says if cross-training is not taking away from recovery time and sport-specific training time and athletes can recover from it, it may be beneficial. He also adds strength and conditioning in the weight room can be an advantage. Kenyans may not have to increase USA runners' injury resistance. George points out strength of movement as being a primary factor in improvement and added weight, strongly or strength muscle that does not increase strength of the sport-specific movement is unneeded. So let me say that one again. Strength or muscle that does not increase strength of the sport-specific movement is not needed, unwanted, and a misuse of resources. Dean explains, cycling shows no improvement in cycling with strength and conditioning, plyos, etc., and shows improvement when strength and conditioning, plyos, etc. are stopped. In cycling, Dean goes on to say, the repeated neuromuscular efficiency wasn't gained through strength, plyos, or strength and conditioning. It was gained through the sport-specific movement of cycling. That is, the movement is real specific and hard to increase through any other movements except cycling. Larson says everyone should do some cross-training because all athletes get hurt. If cross-training is a part of your system, that is, it's consistent, now when an athlete gets hurt, they have already been used to cross-training. He points out that psychological aspect of being important for buy-in from athletes. That is, they believe cross-training is valuable and have no issues doing it. Dean points out in cycling, they do not have time to cross-train because it takes away from development time. He also says competing against performance-enhancing drug users is reality, and no time, energy can be wasted in cycling regarding development. George explains realizing strength gains through cross-training or sport-specific training takes time. That is, it may not happen within the next hour, day, or month. It may take time to realize strength of movement or overall strength. Zach, who is a strength and conditioning coach in the Chula Vista United States Olympic Training Center, worked with 2004 Olympic bronze medalist Dina Castor from 2001 to 2004 and explained she got stronger year to year using basic strength and conditioning. He was careful with her training and never used more than 85% of her one rep max. Zach also explained she felt stronger also because people told her she looked leaner and stronger, which psychologically boosted her confidence. He was very mindful of Dina's running training and made certain to tailor her strength and conditioning training so it did not overreach nor interfere with recovery. Zach started Dina with high volume endurance reps from 15 to 30. Then they decided strength and conditioning would focus more on strength and power with reps from 6 20. Zach is really careful regarding planning strength and conditioning training around sport-specific training. In this way, he keeps athletes recovered, confident, and also strong. George comments and asks a question about athletes reaching or getting close to their potential or maximum strength. And Zach agrees that as you get closer to maximum strength, it takes less time to maintain strength in a year-round program. That is, 2 days to maintain versus 3 to 4 days to build and develop. Zach, regarding peaking, Dina and her coaches would select key events to peak for and stop strength conditioning 2 to 3 weeks before and focus more on footwork drills. Also, some competitions Dina trained through in order to execute her goal of peaking for key events. For Olympic weightlifters, Zach says almost the opposite strategy is used. That is, Olympic weightlifters increase intensity of lifts to 95% days before competition, which suggests Dina and distance runners reduce intensity of lifts because their sport is running, not lifting. Zach also says the Olympic lifters stop squatting about 10 to 14 days prior to competing. A discussion among coaches started of resistance training and different sports to indicate if resistance is added with equipment, like a paddle in swimming or a sled in running, sport-specific movement patterns can be enhanced, reinforced, and taught. Cycling is the exception due to the unique nature of that sport-specific movement. Zach stated Dina did strength and conditioning during certain periods and maintenance strength and conditioning during others. That is, the strength and conditioning fit with her running loads, so her workouts, all of them, could be maximized, and so her running workouts were not diminished from strength and conditioning. Zach mentioned that Dina had success with her program, and a lot of runners wanted to add strength and conditioning too. He suggested everyone will respond differently to strength and conditioning, and everyone should gradually add in strength and conditioning and continue training for a year or two, because the responders or the responses will be different for everyone. In response to Dean's question about genders, Zach says men generally are stronger than women, and if that gap is closer, women may improve in sport because they are stronger. Zach on strength and conditioning. Generally, strength and conditioning needs to be balanced and periodized. That is, certain periods are for strength, maintenance, power, etc., and not all periods or phases happen at the same time. George on strength and conditioning. He says gains in strength or from strength and conditioning are tied to testosterone and hormonal shifts. So, gains in strength from strength and conditioning may not be realized immediately, and the gains may be realized over a 6 to 8 week period. Time and timing is the key and the main factor for growth and development. That is, supercompensation is not realized during the first recovery phase. It may be realized in 3 to 4 recovery phases after fatigue is gone. Hormonal shifts have happened and enough time has elapsed. Another way to explain this theory is strength and conditioning development takes time to be realized to a specific movement pattern in wrestling or cycling or any sport, because the power gained from strength and conditioning has to be applied and used in a specific movement and trained at that new force. I believe there is also a coordination adaptation that also happens that the body takes time to adjust to. Dean points out that amateur and masters and elite athletes have different adaptations to strength and conditioning based on experience. This could be important because most coaches have experienced athletes and inexperienced athletes. That is, they adapt differently. Sven points out that novices show greatest improvements in strength and conditioning in all sports, and in all sports. He goes on to say neuromuscular adaptations actually precede strength gains, and a lot of folks confuse these neuromuscular adaptations to and with strength gains. That is, strength gains come after neuromuscular adaptations. Neuromuscular adaptations are increasing and recruiting proper amount of muscle motor neuron pathways to make movement more efficient, effective, and easier to do. Zach explained the volume of intensity is different for sprinters versus long distance runners, skiers, etc., suggesting both need different neuromuscular adaptations in sport-specific training. Dave Jarrett, who is a Nordic combined ski coach, stated increasing vertical jump height does not correlate to vertical jumping in or off ski jump for Nordic combined skiing. He says the ski jump is so technical that specificity of the ski jump is what needs or requires more attention and specific movement patterns. Zach goes on to say the vertical plus horizontal forces in ski jump are hard to replicate, and getting many reps on ski hills jumps takes a lot of time. The challenge is the ski jump is the best form of training, and all other forms of simulation of ski jumping have little to no correlation with actual jump. And the ski jump takes a lot of time away from other training. Dave and another Nordic combined coach discussed how the fear factor is a limiting factor for ski jumpers because all or most of the simulation jumps have no consequence of daily injury or bodily injury. In other words, fear becomes a limiting factor for ski jumpers because of the risk of injury. Thus, many, if not all, simulation jumps in the weight room or gym are not on actual mountains, or not on actual mountains, that is, do not prepare ski jumpers for fear as well as actual mountain does. Alpine ski coach suggested that they only use strength and conditioning to train the muscle characteristics because simulating alpine skiing is very difficult too, if not impossible. Another coach agreed and said they may be better off training the muscle characteristics of power and speed versus trying to replicate movement patterns in the gym or with strength and conditioning. Jared asks if it makes more sense to spend more time aerobically getting faster or trying to increase jump distance, which references prioritizing time. That is, one focus may take away from the other regarding time spent or wasted. Jared goes on to say most of Nordic combined training has been focused on jump training and strength and conditioning for jump training, and he believes increasing VO2 max or aerobic fitness will help Nordic combined more, although this has not been the focus. Jarrett says the fear factor plays a major role, especially for older athletes who start Nordic combined past their teens. He also says learning the technical aspects of jumping is better learned and developed when athletes are young and gradually jump on smaller to bigger jumps as they develop and learn master technique. Jarrett also says Nordic combined had to implement rules for body mass index, or BMI, because jumpers were losing weight to increase jump distance. He compared the sport, or that part of the sport, to wrestling. George commented that triathletes have a similar challenge with which sports spend time on, and said many triathletes are excellent at one sport and gradually over time become good at other two. The challenge could be, will athletes stick around long enough to realize their potential, or will athletes be out of their prime when the full potential is reached? Jared also said many great young ski jumpers do not have or have not had enough volume training over the years to race competitively. That is, endurance training is built over years, similar to technique. Many young great jumpers in Nordic combined race without a lot of base volume training, which negatively impacts their race outcomes versus older athletes who have 5 to 10 years of volume or base training built over the years. George stated it takes time and years to develop a program, and many times national governing bodies, the press, media, and politics want development to happen faster. George believes it doesn't work out that way. Dean agreed and said it's the difference between developing a result and developing a program. He believes you have to develop a program first unless you're already winning. Jared said the Nordic combined season is from November to March, and during Olympic years or World Championship years, it's very difficult to hold on to fitness because of the amount of competitions. In this sport, you must accumulate points per race to continue race or to continue racing. That is, if you don't have enough points, you can't race. This constant racing without fitness training reduces aerobic fitness over a 4-month period. Dean and Larson suggest doing long sustained endurance training the day after racing and changing the travel day to maintain build aerobic fitness during periods of a lot of racing when training is reduced. George commented that many triathletes raced a lot around 2000 and did not develop because of this. so many or did not develop because of so many races. His spurt is based on points too. But they figured out that they really needed to only compete in a few key events. The rationale was if the athletes were good enough, they would qualify for events with few races. If they weren't good enough, they needed to develop more anyway. George also said he sees two unique groups of triathletes, ones who win Olympics and World Championships, and those who race all the time and lead the World Cup circuit in points. George says these people or groups are never the same. The medalists win, train a lot, then race. They train more for key events instead of racing every weekend, which sacrifices training and fitness. Dean points out if athletes are not winning points or competitions, they may not be ready to compete and that they need more development before competing. He also points out in cycling, the most consistent cyclers are the people who qualify the country for worlds, and the best cyclists compete less because they score higher points and compete considerably less. Dean says they have their best cyclists for worlds. Challenge or paradigm. Some sports seasons is comprised of a World Cup circuit to qualify for World Championships, and this would be similar to any professional sport where they've got the regular season, and in terms of World Cup circuit points, you basically got to either make the playoffs to get to the championship game. So that you can kind of follow that analogy, I will read that again. Some sports season is comprised of World Cup circuit to qualify for World Championships. Some sports qualify to Worlds by placement of prior year's Worlds. Some countries qualify for Worlds through their U.S. Nationals or Continental or Pan American Championships or European Championships or African Championships or whatever the continent may be. And countries have to be very selective for athletes to qualify for the qualifiers due to overtraining, peaking too many times, athletes making a living, and financial costs to get to competitions. Tom, who is the speed skating coach, points out that the USA Speed Skating Federation leadership was less concerned about politics and more concerned about giving athletes a place to develop year-round. This is what he attributes to the long-term success of U.S. speed skating. Scott, also a speed skating coach, added U.S. speed skating did a great job identifying talent, funding program, and growing developing athletes. George said that including coaches is important so that all can be transparent with development and knowledge for coaches and athletes. He points to swimming as a model where in nearly every city you can find a professional coach. He adds that certification of coaches and building coaches' knowledge base is what most triathlon coaches are aspiring to. Nordic Combined coach asked, what's more important, your lactate threshold or your max VO2? Larson says, genes limit the importance of VO2 max, and coaches can have more effect on anaerobic threshold. He goes on to say he has more success when he breaks training up into periods. That is, you first get the athletes very fit, then you start anaerobic threshold training. Larson reemphasizes athletes that start later in teens are competing with other athletes that may have started when they were 5. His point is late starters have to be really good athletes, really motivated, and really persistent because late starters will take longer to develop versus early starters. George begins a discussion about training in general by suggesting all points on continuum from endurance to sprint to strength training must be adequately trained, periodized, and gradually developed. He also says programs should be year-round, so athletes are not restarting each year. George also points out measuring work so coaches know when to progress volumes in either direction, that is, increase or decrease volume. Finally, George says there may be several ways to have or execute maintenance training. That is, fartlek, 15-second high intensity followed by 30-second low intensity. This type of training is less volume of intensity than high intensity for 45 seconds as an example. Bobby said some workouts may be more work for less trained athletes based on their fitness levels. Larson explained, race training frequently plus intense race-like training will not sustain nor build nor develop a base of volume endurance training. Racing is more like anaerobic training and endurance sports. And in endurance sports, you need threshold training and long sustained steady state training to be most effective for a 3 to 4 month season of racing. Dean points out that the system must change and everyone has to be on board if race type training is the main training. Pete starts off by saying his program at NMU, Northern Michigan University, was better than the U.S. ski teams, and his motivation as U.S. cross-country coach is to create a system similar to Northern Michigan University's and to include coaches who want to evolve. Dean says from 92 to 96, cycling was not so successful, and the reality was the whole system needed to be retooled and changed. He also says the challenges were many because not everyone believed the change was necessary or would work. Cycling needed a paradigm shift, a change in philosophy, and for everyone to believe this and buy in. Pete says U.S. cross-country skiing can do what speed skating has done with small numbers or small pool of athletes. He also says Germany has fewer cross-country skiers than U.S., but Germany wins more medals. Sven suggests many folks may not understand the time it takes to be world class, especially if they start in college or at 17 to 18 years of age. He says it could be another 10 years before they reach their potential. Sven says he is not here to become friends with the athletes. He's there to be their coach. He believes many young athletes struggle with that philosophy, and many athletes may not be willing to do what it takes to become elite. He finishes by saying endurance training sports are a lifestyle that is not always easy to do. Pete says the challenge with U.S. cross-country has been to get athletes to understand periodization and do the right amount of work at the right time. He says many of his athletes need to scale workouts back a notch because they may be training too hard or maybe the wrong type of volume of intensity for the season or year. Pete also said monitoring their training with heart rate and lactates has helped U.S. cross-country to make sure they are training at the right intensities. He explained that all the coaches there or at this discussion should define what steady state lactate threshold mean because it may mean different intensities to different disciplines. And went on to say U.S. cross-country sprinters have made or have had more success with lactate threshold training. Larson said he's gotten away from monitoring with lactates and heart rate because there are a lot of variables that influence those monitoring tools. Instead, he teaches his athletes how to monitor training by getting them to become more aware of what the difference is or how the difference feels between steady state and lactate threshold training. Dean explained that in cycling, lactate testing is inconclusive, so they use power meters to determine intensities. But they didn't always have power meters and were misguided for years using lactate monitoring. Pete used a diagram to show how 5 of his workouts vary from 4 millimoles of lactate to 10 millimoles of lactate. He also said it seems like most of the workouts are VO2 max training. Dean says they didn't know what the demands of the sport were in cycling, and when they started using power meters, this helped define what cyclists needed power-wise to be successful. George points out that goals have to be within the athlete's capabilities and may take years to achieve. This comment was in reference to knowing the demands of sport and then completing tasks, demands of sport, to be elite level. George also references the book Moneyball and says that book discusses measuring what is actually important versus measuring everything. Dean says tradition is what many countries have and rely on to be successful, and the USA has technology to overcome the tradition. That is technology to measure what's important and design programs that focus on these demands of sport. George agrees and says the development in cycling has carried over to triathlon because the athletes and coaches see that tradition can be overcome with new technologies, concepts, and ideas. U.S. alpine ski coach points out the progression that has happened in 25 years for track and field and cross-country skiing. He says it's not even close in terms of progress. For cross-country skiing, because the technology like wax ski and other ski equipment, variables that have sped up the speed progression in cross-country skiing. Dean and Larson agree that technology helps improve progress in sport in general. Bobby suggests that physiological markers give data about performances and also help to discern if the athlete is capable physically. If the physiological markers point to great performances and an athlete doesn't perform, it's likely a mental, psychological issue that needs to be developed. He goes on to say, athletes can think about time or results so much that it takes their focus off of effort and negativity or negatively affects results and outcomes. Bobby also says he doesn't use lactate and uses running tests to determine what and how athletes should progress. Tables are derived from these field tests, which approximates what runners should be able to do. Sven, Bobby, and George all gave examples of how injured athletes who were forced to do different workouts because of injuries performed better after injury because the fatigue had left their bodies and they were more recovered. That is fitness fatigue curve. George goes on to say, elite athletes respond to rewards or are motivated by physiological markers, especially when training is taken away from them. That is, most elite athletes train compulsively and when coached not to work out because they are not ready nor recovered. This stimulates change. This is very similar to hydration tests in high school wrestling. George says behavioral punishment and reward affects elite athletes' motivation. That is, taking away something that they want to do. His philosophy is to give more responsibility and control to athlete by exercising less and less control over athlete over time through education of high-performance training concepts and ideas. Randy and Larson both mentioned that training is accumulative. That is, one workout is less important than the workouts leading up to it and the workouts after it regarding high-performance training. Dean, Bobby, and George suggest using heart rate as a measure is challenging because there are a lot of variables that affect heart rate, like environment, mental state, conditions, etc. Dean suggests sports science can be used to support subjective feelings and should not be used to make a law about high-performance training. That is, subjective and objective data markers should be used to get a feeling for what will enhance high-performance training. Belief systems. George and Dean describe the belief system of the athletes being a factor in recovery workouts. That is, the bottom limit of recovery workouts is so low, the workout may not be of value, except if the athletes believe it is. The top volume of intensity of recovery workouts is controlled so athletes do not do too much and hurt their recovery workout or overtrain. That is, many athletes lose feel and are psychologically upset or become anxious when they do not train. Thus, they give these lower volume of intensity type of workouts so they don't lose feel and they feel good about training. Otherwise, they get anxious and they'll work out too much more than they should. Sven said many European countries lack ice rinks or ice in summer and use dry land training to stay in shape. That is, cross training is effective for maintaining or increasing fitness. George points out that movement patterns are what increase specificity of sport. That is, inline skating and speed skating, treadmill running and track running, folk style wrestling and freestyle wrestling. All examples are more specific than strength and conditioning. Getting better at movement pattern is important for neuromuscular responses, recruiting right muscle fibers, and development. So that's the conclusion of the introduction of coaches and the various topics that we've kind of talked about over the last 2 or 3 sessions. Roughly about an hour of audio notes which was condensed probably from about 6 hours of actual discussion among the coaches. The next discussion that we will have will be their training programs, their training designs, their high performance training models, and they will be essentially a periodization and or an annual plan, and we'll give information about how they're doing, what they're doing. Again, this was a little bit of a different type of discussion in as much as it was coaches sitting around a round table, going back and forth over ideas. And how I think this can be effective for any sport really is to take the principles out of what they're actually saying, so that when we understand the principles at a high level, a lot of times principles have a lot of carryover value, meaning the principles to be successful in life generally can be applied in sport, in becoming a doctor, and becoming a scientist, becoming a good wrestling coach, becoming a good wrestler, etc. So not so much that this is going to be, you've got to actually kind of understand what the principles are, and that's what the point of this is, so you can kind of clearly see how a lot of the information within the endurance training think tank can be applied to the knowledge base of wrestling and or wrestling coaches, again, to enhance high performance training, ultimately to give our athletes the best opportunity to have success.